What is the most memorable moment you shared with a stranger who you never saw again? Well, I actually did see this person again, but I think you'll like it. When I was 11, 2002, I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia, a very rare form that's hard to treat. Went through the treatments and bone marrow transplant really well though, and got better etc. When I was 14 I was picked to go to a ranch in Colorado for kids that had health issues like myself. Anyways, on one of the connecting flights I sat next to an older woman and she noticed a car magazine that I had. We started talking, and I told her I liked Mustangs and turns out she had two 82 GTs, had won awards with them etc. It was really cool to talk to her, and when we landed we went our separate ways. Fast forward 2/3 years, can't remember exactly, and my dad and I drove to Arkansas to pick up the mint 82 Great. We get there and start talking to her, and she starts saying the other cars she has, and it finally clicked in my head. She was the lady on the plane. When I mentioned that to her she remembered me, and it was just pretty amazing that in a population of over 300 meters we found each other again. Just my mildly interesting story. I was a horticulture student on a botanical tour of Europe in 1979. I'm at a flower market in Munich and see a plant I don't recognize. The lady working it doesn't speak English. I don't know any German. I see a plant I do know, touch the leaf, and say the Latin name for it. She nods and smiles. I name another plant I know. Her smile gets bigger. I point at the unknown plant and look at her with an expression that I hope says, "Your turn." She tells me the Latin name. We don't speak each other's language, but we can communicate in a language that has been dead for over 1,000 years. Cool. Years ago, I was at the bus stop super early one morning. It was really cold as well. Anyway, there was a guy that I used to see every time I would get the 7 AM bus. Looked like a builder. He always got off near one of the large building sites by the university. We were on nodding terms one morning. There was a fireball/disintegrating meteor. We both saw it. He turned to me and said with a super serious face, "You know our souls are forever linked now." We went back to nodding terms, and I never saw him after I quit early morning classes, I guess, because I remember it. He was kinda right and guys still trolling me. My son was in a pretty serious accident. I was a wreck in the ICU waiting room. A little girl maybe about 9 or 10 years old was with her family, saying goodbye to her great grandmother. She waltzed right up to me and said, "Sir, why are you crying?" I explained my son was very sick. She handed me a miniature puppy doll and told me it was lucky and my son would get better. She was point right. He did, and I still keep that little puppy on my dresser and think of that sweet child. I've shared this on Reddit before. The day I found out my grandmother had a stroke and would never walk or talk again. I was away at college. I finally broke down in a bathroom. A girl came in and asked if I needed a hug. I was crying so hard that I really didn't get a look at her face. I cried on her shoulder for about 10 minutes and then had to pull myself together and leave for class. I never explained myself and she never asked. I never recognized or spoke to her again. I wonder if she sometimes saw me on campus and wondered what was up and if I was okay. Don't know if it counts if I saw him the next day, but I haven't seen him since. I was bartending at a place with outside tables, taking a half break smoking a cig with some regulars when they pointed out this wastoid. He's stumbling, hacking, dry heaving, and spitting down the block. He leans on a couple of poles for a couple of different moments. He gets to his truck, which is parked right in front of us, and is struggling to get into it. I go over to talk him out of driving, and he explains he's not drunk, in the same fashion that all drinks do. As a responsible bartender I urge him again not to drive, and he says something's not right, man. I really don't feel well. So I say, I believe you, but maybe you should go to the hospital. He tells me he is, but he can't afford the ambulance. I convinced him he can't afford a car accident then either, and it will only take a moment for me to hail him a cab. Oh, this is before Uber. He concedes and did under a minimum. I grab him a cab and tell the cabbie to take him to Mercy Hospital, the closest in the area. At this point, he's doing much worse, so I hand the cabbie $20 and tell him to rush. The next day the guy comes back for his car and to thank me. He was having some sort of respiratory attack and would have surely died without medical treatment. He tried to pay me the 20 back, and at that point his tears have me really choking up, and I refused his money, telling him to pay it to the hospital $5 at a time. That will keep the hospital off your back for at least 4 months. After a million thank yous and I owe you my life as he drives away never to be seen again. TLDR, don't assume anything about anyone, and be nice to each other. It might save a life. DC last May for the Gaslight Anthems 59 Sound Reunion Tour. In the back of the mosh pit there were a few of us that would bob in and out depending on the songs. There was a guy in a blue raglan shirt who I was standing close to for almost the whole show, and I sort of felt like he might have been keeping an eye on a few of us back there. During the song The Backseat we both jumped into the pit, and at the crescendo of the music we grabbed hands and jumped around together for a little bit. Don't know his name or story, but we had that pure connection over the music, and it was great. I had just found out my husband of 10 years had cheated on me. I was driving and crying so hard that I quickly pulled over at the nearest parking lot. I parked my car and walked over to the beach, and while watching the waves fell to my knees and just sobbed. Gut-wrenching sobbing. About 10 minutes later, a stranger walked over to me, held her hand out, and helped me get up. She then led me to a bench and sat me down. She hugged me and rubbed my back. She let me cry and would say to me, "This too shall pass." After about 15 minutes, I composed myself as much as possible, and she smiled, got up and continued on her walk. I truly believe she was my guardian angel. I think about that moment all the time. When an older gentleman knocked on my door one day and asked if he could possibly come inside and revisit the home in which he had lived over 55 years ago. It was a pleasure to show him around and to hear his recollection of things that had happened within those walls many years ago, some of which were eye-openers. I never saw him again because he was visiting from the other coast, where he now lives. Still, he told me tales of the house and neighborhood I won't forget. I was on a long late-night bus ride. It was express, so it made very few stops. The bus had maybe 10 people on it in total. Halfway through the trip it made a stop at a small town station, so people could grab a snack or use a public restroom and maybe stretch their legs. I went up to the counter to buy what at that point was my dinner, even though it was after 10 p.m. And when the cashier rang it up I passed a $50 bill to her, and she told me that she couldn't make change. Defeated I went back to my seat on the bus. As everyone piled on and the bus drove away, a lovely middle-aged lady walked up from her seat near the back and politely asked if I minded if she sat with me. I told her she was more than welcome. She sits and proceeds to unpack a small lunch bag. She then split the entirety of her meal with me. She said she had been waiting for the washroom to clear out and had overheard what happened. She said, "I've gone hungry in my life and it sucks. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. So you can share with me." When we were done I jokingly asked if she could break a $50, and we had a good laugh. She stuck with me for the remainder of the trip and was a very interesting lady besides being incredibly generous. I hope she is well. When I was 14, I was trapped in the rubble of an earthquake. I spent 6 hours crawling towards a man whose face I never had the opportunity to see. He was a citizen who didn't leave his name with anyone and never came forward after the fact. It has always bothered me that I will likely never find out who he was or tell him how much comfort his voice gave me during those horrible hours. When I saw pictures of the space I ended up in, much later, I couldn't and can't understand how he was able to stand where he stood for 6 hours without injuring himself or suffering some sort of emotional trauma himself. He's my hero. I'm a type 1 diabetic. I was on a cruise ship with my family, and sometimes I would be stopped on my way out of the ship. Because of my insulin pump, it can't go through an X-ray scanner. I was stopped at one point with this other guy, who jokingly asked me, "What are you in for?" I said insulin pump. He said no way, and took out his pump. We laughed and shared diagnosis stories. The next day, he came up to me in the buffet, thanking God he found me. His pump wasn't waterproof, and he jumped into a pool and forgot to bring insulin vials that could fit into a manual pen. I was able to give him insulin, and we got some coffee together. Never traded contact info, and never saw him again. He was a cool dude.